Good stewards know Jesus will let us through the pearly gates only if we show up as good shepherds and at least figuratively stink. Now that first part is a good paraphrase of our gospel passage today. Jesus makes it very plain. There are poor and needy out there, and if we don't take care of them, we're going to be in deep trouble. The second part is a personal flourish about the stinking. And it's not original with me. I take it from Pope Francis. Pope Francis says frequently, if we don't get out among the poor and needy enough so that we smell like them, we occasionally stink because they stink, then we're not doing our jobs. Here's a modern fable. King Caring was getting old. He knew he didn't have a lot of time left. And he was worried because he had no children. He had been a terrific king, kind, caring. He was a good shepherd. But he feared that he had no one to leave his kingship to. So he sent out 10 emissaries all over his kingdom, the farthest corners of his kingdom, to find 10 candidates that he would interview to find someone who was worthy to succeed him. The first 9 came pretty quickly, and he rejected them quickly. He said, none of them was a good shepherd. None was truly selfless. All of them were, in one way or the other, selfish with their time and with their money. But there was one still left, the 10th. He lived in the farthest corner of the kingdom. His name was Ernest. He was poor. And he had asked the emissary to ask the king to give him 3 months, because the king wanted to make certain that everyone who was selected paid their own nickel to get to the kingdom, that they really wanted to do it. Well, because Ernest was poor, he didn't have the money, so he needed 3 months. Held down 3 jobs, worked 18 hours a day for 3 months, but raised enough money to buy himself a nice suit of clothes that would be presentable to a king. And because he knew he'd be traveling during the winter, he bought himself a nice, warm, woolen coat. And then, of course, he needed a few bucks for provisions, for food, for lodging along the journey. It took him 3 months to walk to the king's castle. He got there in the dead of winter. There was about 15 inches of snow on the ground. 20 to 25 mile-an-hour winds were blowing that snow. The wind chill was below zero, and he was, even with his wool coat, frigid. But he saw the castle, and he said, well, I'll be inside. I'll be warm in just a little bit. But just about as he got to the door, he heard this kind of moaning. And he looked to his right, and there was an elderly beggar there in literally rags. And the elderly man said, kind sir, I'm freezing to death. I won't make it through the night if someone doesn't help me. Please, you be that person. Ernest thought, what would Jesus do? And he said, look, I'm going to be inside the castle in just a couple of minutes. So he took off his wool coat and gave it to the man, and then took off his new suit of clothes and gave his suit to the man as well, and got his rags in return. And he almost threw up because the stench of those rags was gagging. He took another step forward, and then the elderly man said, "And kind sir, you have been truly a good shepherd to me, but, I haven't eaten in 3 days. Can you help me there?" And Ernest said, "Look, okay." And he gave him the rest of his money, thinking, "Look, I can get a job here. I can work another 3 months to get the money to go home." Went into the castle. The king's servants saw him, and every one of them in his mind said, the king's going to have to send out new emissaries. This one isn't going to make it either. He's clearly a bum. But good servants, they took him into the throne room. And when they took him into the throne room, Ernest said, You're the beggar I saw outside." And the king said, "Yes, I am." And Ernest said, "Well, why? Why did you do that to me?" And the king said, "Because I want, as the next king, someone who thinks like the Son of God. I want someone who lives what Jesus Christ tells us to do, who helps clothe the naked, feeds the hungry, cares for the ill." And Ernest, you are that man. Well, King Ernest reigned for 60 years. He died. He took that long walk to the pearly gates. He got there, and Jesus was standing there looking at him with great love. And Ernest asked that question, "Lord, may I please come in?" And Jesus said, "Been following you for decades, Ernest. I'm pretty certain the answer is yes, but let me officially check the record." Jesus came back and said, "Yeah, you have been a wonderfully good shepherd all your life. Yeah, you can come in. But Ernest, I got to tell you, my friend, my brother, you stink." And Ernest laughed and he said, "Well, Lord, for all my years as king, the last 3 days of every month I would go down among my people and I would help them out. I'd give them food and money. And I got to tell you, Lord, they don't bathe so much. I don't think some of them have ever bathed. And if you're there among them for 3 days, you stink just like them." Jesus laughed, hugged him, and walked him through the pearly gates. And of course, the spiritual question of the evening for us is, in what ways do we live our lives the way King Ernest lived his? In what ways do we not? A modern parable. Bill and Carl were members of a Bible discussion group at St. Matthias Parish. It met after the noon Mass each Sunday, and their pastor, Father David, led the group. Well, one Christ the King Sunday, year A, the gospel passage that we heard, and as the meeting began, Father David asked Bill to read it. And Bill was an actor, he had a beautiful, mellow, baritone voice. Of course, was trained in reading, and he read it beautifully. And one of the other members of the group, when it was over, applauded him and said, "You know, Bill, that was the most beautiful reading of that passage I have ever heard." Father David agreed and said, "Okay, Carl, I want you to read it as well." Father David had something in mind. Carl said, "Oh, Father, I'm a terrible reader. Don't ask me to read this. I just can't do it." Carl owned a lawn service, hard-working man, took good care of his family, but not a very good reader. But he was a brave man, and he said, "Okay, if you want me to, I will." So he stumbled and bumbled his way through the gospel passage. And when he was through, Father David knew what he was going to do, because he knew he would read it pretty poorly. And he said, "But Carl, do you understand what you read?" And Carl said, "Yes, Father, I do." And he said, "Much more importantly, do you live it?" And Carl said, "You know, Father, I try to be humble, but, I think my family and I do. One Saturday out of the month, the last Saturday of the month in the afternoon, my family and I go downtown. We go under the interstate where the poor have their tents and their sleeping bags, and we bring them candy and clean socks." And you say, they love the candy, but they love those socks even more because their feet get so smelly and so wet so frequently. And then he laughed. And he said, "And Father, I have a lawn service. At the end of a hard day, I stink. But if I'm with those homeless people for 3 or 4 hours, I stink worse when I leave there than after the worst of my work days. They smell, Father. And I bring that smell with me home." Now, my sisters and brothers, we don't literally need to stink to get into heaven. Being a good shepherd for us is figurative. None of us are going to lead literal sheep. That's why I use the words good steward, because yes, we're good stewards, I hope, of what God gives to us, and we give a sacrificial amount of our time and our money to the poor and needy so that we can live that gospel passage. But occasionally, I hope we are among the poor and the needy to the point when we leave, like Carl, we stink. My sisters and brothers, we are all called to be good stewards, and good stewards know Jesus won't let us through the pearly gates unless we come as good shepherds who, at least figuratively, stink.